Hi, everybody. Steve Coll here, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. Really glad you could join us this evening for what I'm sure will be a deeply informative panel about the election we just passed through and what it tells us about where we are and where we're going as a country. And really looking forward to talking to two important colleagues on our faculty, Professor June Cross and Professor Jelani Cobb, who I'll say more about how they, the role they played in making this extraordinary film, Whose Vote Counts. And two other panelists, Tom Jennings, the producer, and Steve Stirling, one of the investigative reporters who supported the film's work. I just want to thank and acknowledge FRONTLINE and our extraordinary alum, Rainey Aronson, the executive producer there, who helped make this possible and who really embraced it with extraordinary enthusiasm right from the start. I'd like to thank the donors who made this project possible, Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the Ford Foundation, as well as all of those philanthropists who have made possible our Columbia Journalism Investigations enterprise. This was the first time the journalism school had tried to make a film of this scale. Certainly never done something like this with FRONTLINE before, and just so excited that we could support such talented journalists on our own faculty, but also at FRONTLINE and Tom Jennings's team, and just extraordinarily collaborative effort, as I guess films always are. And also excited that the film ended up being just such a piece of excellent investigative and narrative filmmaking about such an important subject, and that it aired nationally 3 weeks before the election. So we'll hear more about where the film came from and, of course, the issues that it elucidated, and all of that is ahead of us in a minute. But I'd love now to share a clip from the film. I hope many of you have seen it, but this will refresh your recollections about some of what it documented.
Long lines as folks wait for their polling place. You can see
they've made it so difficult for people to vote here, just asking too much of people to come out with this virus going on.
It was a major election in the middle of a pandemic.
There's been confusion around what actually is allowed.
It was difficult to request an absentee ballot.
I didn't even know how to do it.
I didn't know about that option to vote through the absentee voting.
Mail ballots, they cheat, okay? People cheat. Mail ballots are fraudulent in many cases.
Absentee ballots delayed in the mail.
I requested an absentee ballot,
but didn't come in time.
That never came.
So I was forced to go and vote
at one of the 5 polling stations.
Voters forced to choose between their health and their civic duty.
Those lines are long in Wisconsin, despite the state's safer-at-home order.
It is unethical.
It was such a putrid decision.
People are going to die because of this.
Claims of voter suppression.
Any ballots received after April 13th will be rejected. 750 ballots so far have been rejected.
I'm really frustrated because my vote won't count.
It was the most blatant form of voter suppression.
Was this all a view of things to come?
I just can't imagine that somebody would do that in this country.
In the impending presidential election? I'm a journalist and historian. I've been studying American elections for years, but I've never seen anything like this moment. The threat of a constitutional crisis over an election where the votes of many Americans, especially people of color, may not count.
First of all, were you able to vote?
You know, I was not, but I had a absentee ballot.
These people wanted to vote this past April in the battleground state of Wisconsin. A primary that would turn out to be a telling dress rehearsal for the election chaos the rest of the country is now engulfed in.
I think we're seeing elected officials, specifically on the Republican side, that are playing politics with people's lives
I started focusing on the state because of its pivotal and deeply partisan nature. It's split down the middle between Republicans and Democrats, and it gave Donald Trump the presidency in 2016 by the exceedingly thin margin of 22,000 votes. It's a microcosm of America these days.
I do believe that there is an attack on our democracy right now.
Along with colleagues at the Columbia Journalism School, I began doing remote interviews there when the pandemic was just taking hold.
We don't need to be trying to have an election in the middle of a pandemic.
With reporters from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and USA Today, we examined the voting, especially the absentee ballots, how they were used and counted, and the political and legal fights around them.
Welcome back, everybody, now that I'm no longer muted. I want to formally welcome June and Steve and Jelani and Tom. Thank you for your time and for your work. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think I would like to use our part of the conversation before we open it up to the audience to really focus in on the core subject of your film, which is voter suppression and the extraordinary election in a pandemic that I imagine historians will be writing about in different ways for an awfully long time, for as long as we have space to tell our own history. And June, I want to start with you. The excerpt makes clear for those who hadn't seen the film, and of course everyone who has, that the foreground of the film, the investigative reporting and the on-the-ground reporting you did, was in Wisconsin, which turned out to be a great choice in terms of the centrality of that state to the election. And still today, the aftermath of the election, I guess tomorrow night there's a deadline where the president has to decide whether he's willing to spend $7.9 million of his campaign's treasury to recount the vote, but whether he does or doesn't, it was close. And the kinds of issues about voter access that you concentrated on obviously were central to what happened in the national election. But what I wanted to ask you about is the origins of your own reporting about voter suppression in Wisconsin. And I know because when you started working on this film as the director and eventually co-writer as well, you had already been on the ground calling people and reporting about what happened in 2016. And I'm honestly not quite clear why you did that reporting or what it was for, but like what had you done that brought you to Wisconsin in this cycle? What did you feel like you knew, and what were you interested in reporting on?
Well, I had gotten, so there's part of the Columbia Journalism School, the Brown Institute for Media Innovation or whatever, had these what they call magic grants. And I guess back in 2017, I applied for a grant. What we knew about Wisconsin from 2016 was that it had the largest drop of African-American voters of any of the 50 states. And I was really curious as to what had happened to those voters. I had a suspicion at that point that social media manipulation via Facebook and Twitter might be the answer. So I actually got a grant from the Brown Institute to begin to go hit the ground in Wisconsin, which I did. And God, it was in 2018, September, October 2018, right before the 2018 midterms. And, you know, it was, I wasn't quite able to do the reporting I had initially set out to do, but I did find that there was a huge amount of legal wrangling going on in Wisconsin over who was going to be able to vote and whose vote would count. And an equal amount of activism going on the ground where people were trying really innovative approaches to getting more people registered to vote. So I was interested in it for all those reasons. How we ended up in Wisconsin, though, for this film, we had originally been working in Texas. We'd gone quite a ways in Texas. And then COVID hit. And Texas was one of the early states that was having, 4,000, 4,500 new cases a day. And we couldn't work in Texas. So, it was like, where do we go? And I was like, well, I got all this reporting that I did already in Wisconsin. Shall we go there? And that's where it ended up. But, Jelani and I and Tom and, our team, Stephen, we were all talking about like, what state should we focus our attention on? So there were a number of states in play. It's just, sort of Wisconsin just had a head start in a way.
Yeah, well, that's how journalism sausage making sometimes looks. What do you got? We got to change course here.
Yeah.
Jelani, I was thinking a little about 2016 in your case too, because you were here, and I remember you addressing our shocked student body the morning after the 2016 result was reported, and in that case, the losing candidate by the same margin actually conceded the election overnight, so we kind of knew where we were the next morning. You had just come back from North Carolina, where you talked to the students about what you'd seen there in terms of voter suppression, so I know you were working on it in that cycle too. And then of course you did this profile of Stacey Abrams in Georgia and her interest in this subject, which also turned out to be quite prescient given how the vote in Georgia has turned out. But what did you feel like you knew, what you thought was important, and what you were interested in reporting more about going into 2020 in this area from your experience in those two areas?
Well, first, I should also say we start by thanking, we've thanked Frontline many times, but also want to explicitly thank Columbia University, Columbia Journalism School, and specifically the Dean's Office for support in this project from the outset. And one of the other things about it was that I was here, but I had been here for like 2.5 months, I think it was, and then the happened and everything blew up, and I just kind of walked in the door, and there were people going, "Journalism doesn't matter anymore," and it was a kind of interesting moment to just show up. And in the midst of this, though, it started seeming like everything was pointing in the direction of this issue at this time. Certainly the Stacey Abrams thing, but when I was in North Carolina, I was riding around with Reverend William Barber, who interestingly enough, I just did a discussion with earlier today. And he was kind of just walking us through all of the particulars of North Carolina and how the legislature had really ratcheted down, cracked down on their voting laws after 2008 when Barack Obama won the state. And it didn't take a lot of imagination to think that this might be a phenomenon that was more widespread than just North Carolina. And so, those things were kind of swirling around in my head. Now, of course, the irony is that, my office is directly across the hall from June's office, and we had not talked about this. We were both kind of in our individual quarters, kind of pacing around trying to figure out, where the story around voter suppression was for, the coming election. And so there was that. There was also the kind of velocity of the laws that were being put on the books. Even then, the kind of temperature of passions that people had, and it just seemed like there was no way. There were a lot of things that we could look at, but there was no way that this wouldn't be one of the most important stories of the year. And then in terms of looking at the specifics of what I want to explore more, is that because I wear these two hats, as a historian and a journalist, I'm very familiar with the pre-1965 version of this story. Pre-Selma, John Lewis, Bloody Sunday, Voting Rights Act, that narrative that a good number of people in the public know. But I felt like the public was less familiar with this as a non-regional story. Ohio, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota, New York State, all these places that were popping up with these allegations and concerns around people's access to the ballot. And that was really what kind of hooked me. It was we have a chance to tell the story of this going from being a regional problem in the middle of the 20th century to being a national problem in the beginning of the 21st.
Yeah, and June, that reminds me of something you said early in this project that really got my attention because, in the heat of an election cycle like the one we just went through, and with such intense polarization around political parties as they are today, Republicans and Democrats, it's easy to get caught up in the idea that, well, it's all about the Republican Party, which obviously is taking the lead in many states in enacting these restrictive laws today. But I remember we were having a conversation about this, and you said, yeah, but for the entire Jim Crow period, it was the Democratic Party that was the instrument of repression. So it's not as if either party has a glorious history. This is structural. When you look at where we are in the aftermath of the election, with this high voter turnout in both parties, the relative lack of disruption at the polling places, the difference between what you saw in Wisconsin in April during that disrupted primary with the terrible shutdown of access to voters in Milwaukee and other parts of the state. What's your analysis about what actually happened in terms, it's early. It takes time to figure out what happens in an election, in my experience anyway, but what's your sense of how voter suppression worked, how voters overcame efforts to keep them away, where the voters won, where the system had an impact, whether in Wisconsin or any place else? And Jelani, I'll come to you with the same question, and then we'll turn to Tom and Steve. Yes, June. Sorry.
You're still muted.
You're still muted.
Sorry about that. We didn't realize how foreshadowing, how much of a forereach, how prescient the Wisconsin story would be. I think Tom had an idea because he had spent a lot of time on the ground there. But I have been surprised by the degree to which the April 7th primary in Wisconsin turned out really to be a dress rehearsal for what happened in November. I think the Republicans were trying all of the legalistic means they could to try to suppress with what one of our interviewees called pinpoint precision, the Democratic voters in the state. And their efforts were so sort of ham-fisted and well publicized that people turned out to vote in spite of it all. And combined with the absentee vote, that was what put Democrats over the top. And it's exactly what has happened in November, actually, I think. And then that combined with Trump's constant harping about absentee ballots not being safe meant that Republicans didn't use them. So, we have Democrats, it was, people called it, I think, the red
mirage.
Red mirage and the blue wave, which is basically what happened. It looked like Trump was winning early on, looked like Trump was winning on November 3rd early on. And then this, this just sort of flood of blue votes from the absentee ballots came through.
Yeah, it's true. Although, Republican turnout was also super high. It just happened that
it was high everywhere, but more,
Democratic turnout was even a little bit higher.
But I think the numbers are still going to show that more Democrats than Republicans took advantage of the mail-in ballots.
I'm sure that's true. And in fact, Jelani, how in communities of color who have in places like Georgia with Stacey Abrams' project, I remember interviewing some civil rights organizers in Georgia in the cycle, asking them, so how does the pandemic affect your approach? And, their answer, which I'm sure you already understand in many more ways than I do, but, they said, all of the ways of voting are hard for our communities, and we can adjust based on the pandemic, but there's no there's no quick fix for our strategy of turning out the vote. So we're just doing everything as intensively as we can. And the fact that that resulted in the vote that it did in Georgia, I think surprised some people who hadn't been watching this organizing going on for the last couple or 3 years, because there have been so many times when it had come close and not quite gotten there. And obviously the margin was small this time around. But why did it work in Georgia this time? Why did, given the obstacles of the pandemic, why did this vision that Stacey Abrams had that you were writing about in that New Yorker profile, break through in this environment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There'll still be like a lot of questions to explore as it relates to that, but there are a couple of things I think are, pertinent, right now, which is that, one, and we saw this in 2012 in Philadelphia with where prompted Mitt Romney to make the very clumsy statement about Obama winning in 2012 because of extraordinary promises to minorities. But he was talking about the turnout in Philadelphia that put Pennsylvania in his pocket, in Obama's pocket. And one of the dynamics that people pointed to there was that there had been this conversation around voter suppression in Philadelphia, and that people had an adverse reaction to it. That they the idea that people who might have normally taken voting, maybe take it or leave it, maybe I'll go out, maybe I won't. But they were incensed at the idea that someone was trying to present obstacles to them being able to vote. So anyone who says that their vote doesn't matter or feels like their vote doesn't matter has a built-in argument against that if people are attempting to stop you from doing it. And so I think that the ghost of 2018, where some fairly extraordinary things happened in Georgia, really did not bode well for the Republicans there, even though the two Senate races are still yet to be decided. But that gubernatorial race that Stacey Abrams won that a lot of people feel
in a manner of speaking, right?
Right. A lot of people feel Stacey Abrams won. I wrote about that. People had a sense. Well, for one, there were 300,000 people purged from voter rolls. A later ACLU report argued that 200,000 of those people were not ever supposed to have been removed from the voter rolls. There were all sorts of mechanisms of reducing the electorate that were going up to court up until the last minute. And the public kind of saw that. Like, the one thing that happens in the course of doing something like that is that you don't really have plausible deniability anymore about why you're doing it. And also an election that was overseen by the Secretary of State, who happened to be the other candidate. So he's overseeing an election that he's running in. And so all those things, I think, were part of it. Additionally, Georgia's demographic changes, have been, even from when I was living there, have been a kind of significant trend. And at the same time, bringing in, the voters that people saw that she's been doing. I also say this, the short part of it is that Stacey Abrams started working on this 12 years ago. And so, a lot of places where we see, like it's going to go blue, is this place going to flip, and so on, people have started doing that work in the last 4 years. And Stacey has more than a decade, as well as Black Vote Matter, which was crucial on the ground there too. So I think those are all partly factors in whatever happens.
That is really fascinating. I hope we'll be able to read you going back on that at some point, because it does seem like it was a long game and a ground game story, because the money that had been dumped into Georgia, kind of top-down strategies for the last 2018, 2016, hadn't really changed things very much, but something was building up in the way you described. So Tom, we've got a lot of folks here who are interested in making great films like this one. And so I wanted to ask you to kind of take us under the hood a little bit in the filmmaking process. I'm not really a documentary specialist. I'm a huge fan of June and our program, and I watch a lot of it, but I don't really understand how you put these structures together for integrating deep reporting and narrative the way you did in this film. I guess I have a sense that there was a kind of a middle act there where we dropped back into the 19th century and came forward again. I recognize that part of the storytelling structure. But once you got to Wisconsin and you were deciding to make the Wisconsin story a microcosm of this larger story and trying to tell it with as much journalistic verve and specificity as you could, while also keeping the big picture there. You know, you and June, I know, did this together, but like, how do you do both of those things in documentary filmmaking? How do you report, and then how do you kind of conceptualize the scripting so that you get that balance of foreground and background?
Well, that's a really good question. Very interesting question. I don't know is the answer. I just do it. That doesn't help you at all, I know. But I think it really just comes down to a lot of work, just a lot of work, and a lot of trying to read tea leaves at the beginning, starting back in August when we first got together, deciding on places to go, throwing our weight and our luck out, casting out, looking for something, going to Texas, and then coming back, not really pursuing it after the pandemic hit there, as June was talking about. Wherever you go, whatever you do, and it's just like anything that you do and anything that you teach at Columbia, it's that you just get your hands really dirty. You go out and source material, you go out and find characters, and I think that there is something that's a little bit different than what, say, print does a little bit, which is what we have to find characters that do translate well into the film format. And that takes an extra amount of work. It takes a lot of work. It's not just finding the right person, but the right person to convey well that kind of material, that kind of the issues that you're talking about. And I think, fortunately, in places that like Milwaukee, there's an abundance of really strong characters. People like Melody, who is the woman who runs the organization in North Milwaukee with her mother. It's just a wonderful story. They're wonderful characters, and people like that, when you bring them into the frame, they just suddenly pop, and everything that you've reported is manifest. And you hope to have that. You kind of know it's an instinct that you develop over time of a good character, just like you would in a good report, in any kind of reporting. This is the kind of thing that you know deeply, that you invest in once you're out in the field. And at a certain point, you kind of just go with it. You dismiss other stories, or you shoot the bejesus out of everything, and then you pull back and in the edit, you figure out who's the best person to be telling these stories. There's a lot of stuff that we couldn't tell in the end. A lot of things that we got on camera that we couldn't pursue in the final film. I think we have at least 2 other films, in those edit drives. I wish we could do them. That's a brief, short synopsis. But I'm sorry, I think that there's plenty of ways to answer that question. I just think it's a lot of elbow grease and having instincts for who makes a good character, and then getting the right people like Tim Grucha and Rachel Beth Anderson, the DPs on this film, to go out and shoot beautiful images.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in and speak highly of my collaborators for a second too? Which is, first, no, Tom, we can't ever do those other 2 films. But I think that this film was exceptionally hard to do because of the pandemic. Also, just because of the subject matter, which was a moving target. And I really have to commend the whole team from Columbia Journalism Investigations, as well as June and Tom, for working extraordinarily hard on this. I think that, I don't think that Tom or June slept in October. We were getting, I would do some narration, and then you know, I because, you know, I have small children who wake up in the middle of the night, you know, I might wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to give someone a bottle, and I'd see that I was getting updates or emails that came in 5 or 10 minutes before that, like, we've changed, we needed a narration. And I was like, I know why I'm up, but why are you up? And so, you know, people worked really, really hard to make this film happen.
That's awesome. And let me bring Steve into the conversation. It was a feature of this project, a real opportunity because of the support we had from philanthropists, that we were able to attach a postgraduate investigative reporting unit to run in parallel to and to support the film, investigating some of the same subjects, and some of that work ended up, you know, as an important part of the film's findings too. And Steve, you led that team. You're a data reporter who came to us from the Newark Star Ledger and NJ.com, and you worked with USA Today Network, which, as well as Frontline, which was a really wonderful partnership that manifested itself with big stories in the Milwaukee paper, which is part of the USA Today Network, while the film was in train. And one of the big projects you did with USA Today was basically to look, as I understand it, was to look at the history of rejected mail ballots, to collect big data around that, which requires going from state to state where the votes are organized, and then analyzing and producing a kind of projection of how many votes were likely to be disqualified because of the rules around mail voting and the structural problems around mail voting, and how that was likely to be distributed among voters of color and geographically and in other ways. And basically, the finding was that voters of color were much more likely to have their votes disqualified through the mail process. But your reporting went into this in great depth. And now you published this just before the election and before the film came out, I guess, or around the same time as the film came out. And what you were telling us was, based on history, this is what we expect, or this is a range of things we could see happen, you know, as statisticians advise us. So here we are after the election. What do we know about what did happen? How many votes were disqualified? Is this something that you can get to as a journalist over the next weeks, or what are your initial impressions?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a process, but by all accounts, from what we've been able to collect so far and what we've seen, I mean, there's nothing here but, you know, to call it a true American success story. I mean, you know, in virtually every state that we've looked at so far, the rate of rejection came down significantly from 2016.
Why do you think that happened?
You know, I think you can credit it to a lot of different factors. You know, as we've sort of reported out follows to this, you know, you have, you know, there was a lot of attention paid to this and voters were careful. You know, B, you have things like in certain states like Georgia, for example, you know, the curing provisions that are in place to allow voters to correct mistakes on their absentee ballots. You know, in the early returns, we can already see that there were at least 59,000 canceled ballots, which is an indication that people, when a ballot is canceled rather than rejected, that somebody is, you know, filling out another one subsequent to that. So presumably that's an indication that that part of that process worked. And there was also a lot, I mean, you know, a lot of care taken and a lot of, you know, work done. You know, we like to talk about how hard we work, but I can't imagine being an election official during the last 6 months or so, because the amount of work that they had to do to get this to run smoothly is really truly incredible. So I think there are a lot of different factors that come into play in seeing the overall numbers being lower, even if the trends we were expecting still played out.
Give us just a little bit of flavor of the work you actually did. I mean, to construct this projection, you had to collect an enormous amount of data that is held by state and maybe county authorities, I don't know. Did you use Freedom of Information Act requests? How did you put it all into one big set that you could work with statistically to make the projection you did?
Well, we had used, and before the pandemic sort of scrambled all of our plans, we had been working with the federal EVES data, which is we'll call it a pretty good database showing some various statistics on voting around the country. And we used that as a basis, and sort of knowing that there were holes in certain spots for sure, because not all states report. Just like, everything else in this country, everything varies from state to state in terms of definitions and stuff like that. So the process was really sort of understanding all of these different state policies and how they define different things, and then reaching out to states where we were missing data and, trying to fill in as many gaps as we could. And I think we ended up with coverage of 97% of the population at the end of the day. And on a county by county level, which gave us a big pot of data to look at.
Right. You mentioned the important point that the rate of rejection appears to have declined, and I think journalism played a role in that, in calling attention to the problems, really shining a light on the structure of the problems throughout the summer, and the film was a part of that. If you read the history of news, and I'm not an expert, but I remember being struck by how the kind of origins of a lot of what we call news today was a form of warning to communities that needed to know what was coming. And when I thought of that this summer, when there was so much focus on the post office and on the rejection of ballots and the structural problems of infrastructure around mail voting and counting, it was a lot of warning that journalism was engaged in. And that can be sometimes a very valid function of investigative reporting. It's not just revelation and accountability, but something that's a little bit forward looking. And so June, on that note, looking forward, let's assume, just for the sake of discussion, that the Electoral College does its job and the president leaves office in January, whether Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who gave a speech this week indicating that he would force him out if necessary. I mean, that's the way I read his speech. One way or another, off he goes. And now we move into a post-COVID, post-2020, post-Trump democracy, where the elections of 2022 and 2024 are going to present many of the same conflicts and challenges, I would imagine, maybe even more intense ones. How do you see the journalistic agenda in this area where you've been working now for 4 or 5 years, along with other things? How do you see the agenda for us as reporters looking out over the next couple of cycles? What should we be working on?
Well, I think immediately, this was not just a presidential election. This was an election in which 50 different state legislatures were also elected. And the Republicans actually made gains in those states. So, there was a lot of talk about gerrymandering and changes to state elections laws over the last 10 years. And I think there's going to be even more over the next 10 years because, the Democrats aren't the only ones that were learning from this experience. The Republicans are learning as well. And I've read some things, where they said they were going to put more emphasis on absentee voting among their own people. But also they were going to do a dig. I just got a text from, there's a group called True the Vote that's out of Texas. It's was involved in 3 different lawsuits, and they're withdrawing their lawsuits, and they said they were going to do a deep data analysis to discover exactly where the problems with election security were. So I think there's going to be even more effort among Republican-led legislatures to tighten the voting laws even more. So this hasn't, there's a moment of relief among those who wanted to see the Democratic ticket win, but the Democratic ticket only won at the top. So there's still a lot of reporting to do at the state level, because next year we're going to redistrict every state in the United States, and it's going to be a huge story. And the Republicans aren't going anywhere. In fact, they've even got greater hegemony. So we've basically got at least another 10 years of sort of this polarized environment to deal with.
Yeah.
Which is scary, actually.
Yeah, and just to annotate that for students who might not, especially international students, what June's referring to in the United States, every 10 years we take the census, and then the census is used as a basis to decide how many congressional and legislative districts there are in each state, and then the state legislatures draw the maps every 10 years, and they often, shock, act out of self-interest to advance whatever is the dominant party in a particular state. And so the success that the Republicans enjoyed in state legislative elections, even in states where they lost the presidential, like Pennsylvania, means that they have an opportunity to entrench their advantage on these maps over the next couple of years. Jelani, I'd welcome your thoughts about what the agenda is going forward, but I wanted to ask you about being a TV star, which I don't have any experience with. So I wonder, like, you've made the transition now to a couple of films, and you seem like so comfortable in your interviewing techniques. And you did have some confrontational interviews set up with folks on the other side of the voter suppression argument. You handled them, I thought, beautifully, and the film makes good use of them. But tell us about the experience at your, let's see, midlife of making the transition from historian and magazine writer and book author to television correspondent. What are the skills that you discovered you had? What did you have to learn about just having a presence when the cameras are rolling, the way you want to have it?
So first off, I define this stage of my life as youthful. Thank you. But so it's the other thing is that thank you for the compliment, but I'm acutely self-aware, or self-conscious in these other roles. And so one of the things that I try to do is use the thing that we always tell students to do, your ears. And so I listen and observe. I try to take notes on what people are doing without getting in the way, and fortunately benefit from the insight and wisdom of my colleagues who've been doing this much longer than I have. But the other part of it is that we really did try hard to convey to people at the outset that we wanted to give them a fair shake. And for people who came down, and I've, for the last 7 years, written at the New Yorker, and there's a whole body of stuff that people can look at. They know where I'm coming from politically. And what I tried to do was say, I've done a lot of opinion writing, what I think, but I want to be as fair as possible, just in doing our due diligence. And also because I wouldn't want someone to just kind of put their thumb on the scale, if I were doing an interview with an outlet that typically had a different slant. And we were also thinking about Frontline and Frontline's reputation, for fairness. And so those were all things that stayed, to most instances, one notable exception that seemed to work fairly well. And I think that the other part is just, I've benefited from being curious. When I worked with Anya Borg and James Jacoby on the documentary on policing in Newark, the first one that we did in 2016, James said to me one day, "Oh, watch, you're gonna want to do a bunch of films after this." And this was in the middle of the slog where it's like blazing hot. We're in Newark. The pavement is 100 degrees and we're following the gang unit around. And I was like, no, I'm not coming back to do this again. And sure enough, as soon as that one was done and we saw it, I was like, oh man, this is interesting. I kind of think, I'd be curious about doing this again. And so I think that's how it's become, a pursuit.
I want to turn to the audience here in a minute and take their questions. So folks, I guess the chat is as good a place as any to post your questions. And as we move along, I will look through them and so will some colleagues help send some our way. So please go ahead and start sharing your questions. Tom, just this to pick up on where Jelani just left off in terms of the completeness of the film and the effort you make as a producer to try to be fair and to provide the right kind of perspectives. So you had Jelani, the historian, take us back into the history of structural voter repression from, I don't remember where he started, but certainly the end of the Civil War to the present day. That was a tour de force, a bit of context, but you also had the kind of intellectual history of the Republican efforts to license voting in the modern era, regulate it. And one thing I enjoyed about the film, even when it got a little testy between Jelani and that guy from the Heritage Foundation, who I can't remember. Yeah. But I like the fact that that basically the argument that he wanted to make came across in the film. I mean, at least I understood what it is that they go in front of courts and say, and how they kind of frame their arguments to voters and others. So when you're producing a film like this and you're calling people up across this ideological divide, like what's your technique for getting them to say, say yes, I'm willing to trust you to share my perspective fairly?
The technique is to show a true, sincere, intense level of interest in their perspective. That's always the case, is always wanting to see and hear what they have to say. It's pretty simple. And then there's a point at which that they have to, jump out of the plane and hope that their parachute's going to open, for them. And I think that that's whatever part of the spectrum that you sit on, it's always going to be a risk to sit down in front of a camera. Not a Mike Wallace thing, not just a Mike Wallace thing, but a frontline thing. Any kind of thing where you're actually putting yourself on record to be parsed and also edited. And so somebody like Hans von Spakovsky, it was a tremendous effort on the behalf of a lot of people on our team. A lot of them Columbia graduates, I might add. Marcia Robiu, Bianca, Bianca Ladipo. There's an amazing cast of characters on our side behind the camera who really put a lot of work into getting people to sit down and agree to it. And then you yourself as the producer, as the director, have to go on the phone and just say, kind of push the final button, say, this is what we're going to do. And you just be completely honest. This is what your film is about. And by the way, Jelani Cobb is going to be doing the interview. Excuse me? Jelani, what? Jelani Cobb's doing the interview? We do get a lot of, and it's like, yes, Jelani Cobb's going to be doing the interview. And at a point well ahead of the time before it's just a kind of a gotcha thing. There's no gotchas here. They know exactly where we're coming from. So Hans von Spakovsky is a great example of somebody who it took 6 months to get him to go on camera. And even when he did go on camera, he was very vocal of how much he distrusted us. But he went on camera, and I think he understood the mechanism, and he understood that this was a chance for him to do what you exactly said, Steve, was to get his point of view across.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing too?
Of course.
I think that there's a dynamic that I've noticed. I think that students would be kind of wise to play to this or keep this in mind. People who consider themselves to be intelligent and people who are able to articulate their ideas in the way that they want, often have this implicit belief that if I just talk long enough, people will understand right.
Yeah.
You know, that if I'm like talking, and I've had this, you know, one of my colleagues had the best, you know, example of this. She interviewed a Klansman. She is a Black woman reporter. And he just kept trying to explain to her how belonging to the Klan was the most reasonable thing that he could do. And this was like 5 years ago. This wasn't like a really long time ago. And so she, you know, being a very consummate professional, just kept spooling him out more thread, you know, and he just, well, you have to understand, he just kept thinking, he kept going. And I think it's sometimes people who see the world very differently than you, or people who don't trust you, still have an idea that, you know, if it is one-on-one, they can point out how they actually are the person who is on the right side of the question.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, I should say, I'm not saying that Hans is a Klansman. That was not what was meant.
I think one thing I should add about this is that there are plenty of people who said no to us too, and it took a lot of work to get to that final no. But as a journalist, as a documentarian, you have to be relentlessly positive and optimistic that you're going to get these people. And until the camera's rolling, I'm assuming I'm still going to get them. But as an example, in Wisconsin, there were plenty of legislators that would not come on camera with us, Republican legislators. There were 2 who did, and they were actually excellent interviews.
Yeah.
They were wonderful interviews.
Didn't you get Scott Walker also?
We did. We got Scott Walker as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when you run for president, you talk to a lot of people, but that was a good get too, I thought. You know, Steve, just before I start taking questions in the chat, because we're getting some good ones, I just wanted to ask you one thing, also thinking about the students who are listening. So, you know, we have a data journalism degree program. We teach a lot of data at the school. You kind of came into it from the newsroom side and from the community that built up around data-driven investigative reporting at NICAR and at IRE, I imagine, as well. You know, where do you think we are in what data journalism can do that other techniques just can't get to because of the sheer scale of the data? I mean, in other words, you look at your role in this project and you can see that it was a distinctly data-driven, huge set of insights that you were able to contribute. But after 10 years of doing it, when you go into something like this, how do you try to figure out where you can make a difference with your techniques and your computational work?
I mean, I think it's you know, sort of similar to, you know, what Jelani was saying, is you just have to be curious. You have to, you know, you have to look for what's out there, and you have to, you know, a lot of data journalism is you trying to find data and failing, or finding it and not finding anything in it, or not finding the thing, it's not exactly the way that you want it to be, so it won't work for X, Y, and Z. It's not exactly a glamorous or easy process, generally speaking, but you know, I think I think, you know, looking back as to, you know, over the last 10 years and that I've been doing this, I mean, it's certainly, there's certainly much more possible, because it's, you know, in some part because it is a branch of journalism that is helped when technology advances. So more things are becoming possible every day through this kind of thing. But, you know, I still think that it's, you know, there's a lot of introspection that needs to be done, and there's a lot of, you know, it's still very much a growing part of the industry. You know, I think there's going to be pains that come with that, especially as it branches out into all these other facets of the industry.
Yeah, well, it's been quite a year. I mean, with the pandemic and all of the amazing data visualization work and kind of transparency work that data journalists have done to keep the public informed about what was happening from day to day, particularly at a time when the federal government wasn't anxious to play that role. That was, I thought, you know, a real demonstration project of how far data journalism has come in as an explanatory function. And then you, in the election, you see the investigative punch of work like yours, and you think, yeah, we're kind of zigzagging, but definitely moving in a direction. All right, let me take some questions in the chat. First from Frederick Golden. June, let me pitch this to you, but Jelani, you could just as easily take it. Essentially, it's a media criticism question, but a good one. And it says, we know that voter suppression is essentially directed at Black voters, voters of color, and yet in the post-election environment, the media coverage has been driven by the president's claims and those of his allies that somehow Republican ballots were suppressed or denied, even though there wasn't any evidence of that. So is this a situation where the president's sort of loud volume and brazen disregard for bringing evidence to bear has actually changed the story, because we're still chasing down his false claims and really not examining how far suppression worked in the ways that it has been intended for the last century?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And it's also frustrating because, these are things that have come up again and again and again. And, even, in that wonderful Columbia Journalism Review issue that Kyle oversaw on disinformation, we saw that even when you repeat the disinformation in order to disabuse people of that idea, it still reinforces it in some people's minds. And so it seems as if there's an actual debate about whether or not Republican votes were canceled out or whether or not there was massive voter fraud. And just as we've been talking, that sound you heard was an alert that came through on my screen saying that Trump had fired the Department of Homeland Security official who made the statement that there was no evidence of inappropriate or what he said, no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes or changed or was compromised in any way. And so Trump just fired him and tweeted that that was not true, that there was massive fraud in the election. And so we could run with that conversation as opposed to saying, well, what happened with signature matching, what was the net impact? And did people outpace suppression? Was suppression not a factor? What was the net effect of voter ID laws here? In all of those things. The other thing that I will add, though, is that we're kind of seeing a broadened palette of people who are susceptible to voter suppression, and that was always the case. Even in the Jim Crow South, poll taxes could just as easily disenfranchise poor white people. They may or may not have been enforced as readily, but all of the mechanisms that were used to disenfranchise Black voters had the potential of at least disenfranchising some other populations as well. And so now we see that same kind of dynamic happening, except maybe more intentionally. So Indigenous voters, Native American voters in the Dakotas have these issues. People who are younger, who tend to skew more Democratic, are also facing issues about access to the ballot, and all these kinds of ways it becomes a kind of patchwork of populations that are affected. We don't really have that conversation, and we're still running down the latest thing. Granted, this person does have a nuclear arsenal, so it's tempting to say, oh, we need to talk about what's on his mind. But in some other ways, it's the magician saying, look at this hand, don't look at what's in the other hand.
Yeah, no, that's very, very well said. Yeah, and this point about suppression of votes in rural areas, particularly, that was an interesting kind of aspect of the president's decision to try to delegitimize mail voting, because for a long time, rural and older voters in Republican-dominated areas depended on mail voting. So he ended up kind of disenfranchising many of his own followers in places like Arizona, where mail voting is 80% of the vote. There's a lot of people who live very far away from any place to go vote in person who ended up being caught in this crossfire. But anyway, June, I've got a question from Ralph Begleiter, the veteran CNN journalist, terrific journalist. And He asked a question I think you might be willing to answer, which is essentially, isn't it an embarrassment that in the United States, outstanding documentary journalism is no longer commissioned by financially well-endowed journalistic institutions like newspapers, TV networks, but is supported and only sporadically by financially challenged ones such as Columbia, PBS, et cetera. I think we can hold our own, but the point is the same. What is the consequence of the funding structure for the kind of work that you want to be able to do and that you did in this case?
Hey, I mean, after it took me 5 years to raise the money and complete my last documentary, and I had sworn I was never going to do another one until I had lunch with you that day, and you said that you were at Columbia.
Yeah, I got a big pile of money. Would you like it?
Right. You said Columbia and Frontline were talking about doing this film, and the money was already secured. And I sort of I remember coming home and saying to my husband, shit, the money just fell out of the sky. I can't turn it down. Which has never happened to me in like my entire career. So, Ralph premised that question with, isn't it an embarrassment? And, yes, it is an embarrassment. I mean, I worked my entire career to get to CBS News primarily because I wanted to do documentaries, and I got there just as a guy named Larry Tisch had just bought the company, and the first thing he did was basically defenestrate it and close down all of the foreign bureaus. And here we are in the middle. This is then in the beginning of the Gulf War under George H.W. Bush. And we didn't have a foreign bureau. We were basically looking at CNN to try to figure out what was going on. And shortly thereafter, I had come up with an idea for a documentary that I remember taking to one of the vice presidents. And he said, that is a great idea and it would make a wonderful documentary, but we're not doing documentaries anymore at CBS. And, thank God I ran into the executive producer of Frontline, shortly thereafter, actually in a plane in a Hudson News in an airport. And I had that elevator pitch that we're always telling people to be ready with. And I pitched him and he bought the story. Saved my career. So is it embarrassment? Yes. But, this cycle that we're in with the news of demanding eyeballs and 24-hour news cycles, nobody has money to go out and cover the news the way that we used to. I mean, the three, ABC, NBC, and CBS nightly news still make money, and actually together, even any one of them still on any one broadcast draws more audience than any one of the cable networks do. But the fact remains that nobody's got the money to do, Frontline does documentaries. These things cost, an hour-long doc is somewhere between $500,000 and north of $1 million. It's not an insignificant amount of money. HBO does them, Frontline does them. Otherwise you're into Independent Lens and POV, which are all PBS things. But it's increasingly difficult to fund these. And, when you go to the conferences that documentary filmmakers have, these days, there's, sustainability, how do you sustain this career is one of the primary points of conversation.
What is the entry of Netflix and HBO and the kind of big West Coast money? I mean, what do they want? Presumably they're not doing films like the one you just did.
No, they're doing murder.
What is their impact on the people?
They're doing infotainment. They're interested in mostly murder mysteries or celebrity. So like if you have an in with a celebrity or a particular access, or can do something like what was that thing that we were all watching during the pandemic?
Oh, Tiger,
yeah, the Tiger King, yeah. So like really weird stuff like that. There's always going to be a market for that, and I think that's what Netflix is mostly interested in. I know Tom, you're in this area as well.
Yeah, I think that there are sporadic examples of people and producers, agents, independent people who are really passionate about projects that do journalistic kind of filmmaking, the kind of filmmaking that June and I do. But it's really Frontline that has. I'm not going to say that only has these ethical standards, but has journalistic credentials, let's say, and is, Rainey Aronson, the executive producer, Andrew Metz and Frank, everybody there, we're just relentlessly talking about how to adhere to serious journalistic principles. And that's just what is different about what we do at Frontline. What I do, I'm an independent producer, so what really Frontline does, and then they'll hire somebody like me, and then I'm a journeyman, journey person. But there are, CNN does, to the Beglater comment, yeah, CNN certainly does long form, but it's independent. It's all independent, producer driven, and it's acquired. Frontline is exceptional that way. I am an independent, but I'm kind of part of a corral of people like June and others, Marty Smith, and who come in and are consistently part of, and James Jacoby, who Jelani has worked with as well, who consistently work in the same, we keep on getting, fortunately, getting re-upped to do another film. Doesn't happen like that anywhere else in America, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amy Antelis is building a stable at CNN Films, but it's independent films, not.
Well,
yeah.
So good question from Alexis Clark for you, Jelani, going back to Hans von Spakovsky. She asks, his claims of voter fraud have been discredited, yet he seemed defiant in his beliefs. When you're interviewing someone who is confrontational yet has no evidence to support his claims, what's your approach? Are you relentless in showing how wrong he is with a debate style, or do you give him the space to speak his unfounded, to kind of create unfounded controversies? Or that's maybe an either-or choice that I don't think you would want either side of, but let me just ask it open-endedly. What's your approach?
I think we did both, or at least I tried to do both. Yeah. Which, I will say that, when we interviewed Scott Walker, I felt like afterward I had given him too much rope. Like I hadn't challenged him enough, on things that were factually not necessarily accurate. And so when we went to Hans von Spakovsky, I said, I'm not going to make that mistake. But at the same time, this was not, the college debate society. I wasn't going I wasn't trying to win the interview. I did push to say, one, issues of fact, where those things are wrong, I'm going to push back and not let that go unchecked. But two, I really want to get this person to talk about how he sees the world. And when the interview was over, June, turned to me and said, what did you think? And I said, well, I think he believes what he says. Because I had a question going into it, because there was so much that didn't hold up, so much that was factually inaccurate, that if he was just a cynical political operator, or if this was a person who really is a true believer in his cause. And at the end of it, I said, I think that this person really believes what he is saying, which means that, kind of winning the argument is not really a thing, but, getting this person to elucidate what he really believes and pointing out where that departs from the established fact, and then presenting it to the viewers. And one of the things that really caught me was that he kept making reference in the interviews to how much he had done for Black people. He talked about, he argued civil rights cases and so on. And he is from Huntsville, Alabama. My family grew up, part of my family, my maternal side is from Alabama. Implicit within this was all of Alabama's history as it related to these questions. And so he knew where I was coming from and I knew where he was coming from. And then I just said, John Lewis, was John Lewis wrong? And he couldn't stop him. He said, yeah, he was wrong. And I was like, okay. No reasonable person is going to say that you are a more stalwart defender of Black people's rights than John Lewis was. And so I was kind of like, good. At the very least, we know where we stand as it pertains to these questions.
Yeah. Steve, I'm going to toss a version of a question to you. Our audience member asks, in Florida, we're seeing suppression starting with real ID for driver's licenses. If you don't have access to a computer and internet, you can't get an appointment to get the basic information into the system. Would you consider reporting on these root problems? And I know those ID laws, real ID as a particular kind of advance on the use of IDs to regulate access to the vote, suppress access to the vote. But the version I want to ask you, Steve, this is the state of Florida. When you look at reporting on voting patterns around the country from a data perspective, like just advising young journalists, where do you go to get the data sets or file the FOIA requests that can give you insights into patterns about things like the impact of a new ID law in a particular state, for example? Like give us a little bit of a mini seminar on how to construct a data project around a question like that.
So, I can, give you a bit of what, we're sort of doing now as an example of that. It's when you have something new like that, voter ID laws, or, there are a lot of different types of laws that were put into place over the course of the last several years that, critics say will limit or restrict voting. And just understanding how that data is tracked in some form or another. And that's how we're starting to do that process now. I mean, it's important to remember that places are still counting. So we don't have all of that data yet, but what we're seeing in early data is that these are the reasons that ballots are being rejected, for example, are problems with IDs or problems with notaries or problems with witnesses, all of these sort of things. And so, ahead of, an event like an election, our process is just making sure that we understand all of the places that information is going to be posted, who it's going to be posted by, and how we can acquire it, and have a plan in place for sort of assimilating all of that together. Because, you're in a situation like this anyway, you're in competition. So most of it is just sort of preparation and having an understanding of, what you want to look for. And if you can't find it, if it's not readily available in sort of documentation or data that you've found, you can look into ways to build it. Collect that data yourself if it's not available, through traditional means. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about doing it, but it's, if you don't know, it's important to talk to the people that do, and get a sense of what exists and what doesn't, so you can kind of chart a course for yourself.
So as we head toward the end here, let me ask a question that's a little bit drawn from the alert that Jelani got about President firing somebody at DHS who had dared to question the evidentiary basis for his continuing claims of large-scale fraud and rigging. I guess we can see from the behavior of Republican voters and from opinion polls and the like that the president really did succeed in convincing a lot of his followers that mail voting would be unreliable and perhaps fraudulent. You hear a lot of that. And now he's continuing to just assert, without any court backing him, without any credible news organization endorsing or coming up with an investigative path. And just, it's remarkable the gap between his speech and the evidence. Usually when you get these highly polarized controversies around something like Benghazi or the impeachment, at least there's a body of evidence that people can argue about. I mean, there's really nothing to work with here. And yet he seems to be convinced that he will persuade a large number of Americans that this most sacred aspect of our kind of self-image, however self-deluded it may be in the light of history, that there really is a franchise and it really is exercised at voting time, that this is untrustworthy. So my question is, from your reporting in Wisconsin and other places, and whether it's in communities of color or in poor white communities, how susceptible are the American people to the idea that we just can't trust this basic thing that we're supposedly organized around, which is the right to vote and the fact that the vote is a fair expression of popular opinion as a snapshot in time, wise or unwise. So are we headed into a really dark place where the American people basically are persuaded to lose faith in voting? Or do you have more confidence that we'll push past this noise and at least have some kind of flawed normalcy again around our idea of what an election can deliver?
Yes,
and it's such a light question, but whoever wants to take it up, June, Jelani, Tom, you guys have been out there in the field. Give us a report of what it feels like out there on this.
I'll say I'm in the dark place. With increasing numbers of Republican conspiracy theorists moving off of mainstream social media into Parler and whatever the other one is that they're using. I just read also the Michigan County, Wayne County, Detroit Board of Governors has just deadlocked on whether or not to certify the election. I mean, this is becoming the nightmare scenario. I mean, Biden won Wayne County by like 148,000 votes. We're not even talking about anything within the realm of realism, but I'm worried. Jelani and I have had this conversation about whether we're in 1860 or 1876, and I tend to fall down on 1860. I think are you still in 1876, Jelani?
It's very bad. I've been 1824. I've been 1800. We talk about all these disputed elections, I don't think we're in 1860 anymore. I did have an 1860, a week. It was like, okay, this is Abraham Lincoln, everyone's going to war. But, to June's point, I just became acquainted with this idea that is popular in political science literature called pluralistic ignorance. Mm-hmm. And what it means is the principles of democracy are that people can evaluate information and come to reasonable conclusions. And if you sift that through a broad enough array of people, you will filter out the numbers of people who will just kind of make dumb or erratic decisions. And you can put that in a structure where you'll maximize people making the best decisions possible with the information they have. But pluralistic ignorance is an idea that if you have a large enough group of people getting bad information from one source, it offsets that essential foundational presumption of democracy. And so I worry about that a good bit when we look at things, even if we're taking something out of the explicitly partisan realm to the COVID situation that we're in, and realizing that there are many people in the country who think that only about 10,000 people have died. And that all these media reports of there being 250,000 deaths and projections that we can have twice that number potentially if things are not checked fairly soon, they just simply don't believe it. And the report CNN did about the woman who's the nurse and has people who are on ventilators or taking extreme measures to keep them alive, and they still don't believe that they have COVID. And so I think that those things alarm me. In the long haul sense of it, we've seen these periodic crises before, and the country has navigated them, usually not without acquiring some scars along the way. So maybe there is this kind of healthy projection where people go, you know, should you buy Apple stock? And they go, sure, you always buy Apple stock, you know, but maybe, you know, the United States is that, you know, kind of long enough established tradition that you can bet on it figuring some kind of way out of it. But I certainly don't think that we are in an enviable position as it relates to these things now.
Well, I agree. I feel like it's going to be a tough few years, maybe a tough decade. So let me conclude then by thanking you, Jelani, June, Steve, and Tom for sharing your time and experience and insights. I'd also like to thank Dolores Barkley, who helped organize the event, and a member of our faculty and part of the Ira Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights, which Jelani directs, and Julie Pozo Cepeda and Stephanie and the team who helped organize this. Really a privilege to be with you and to talk with you. And I thank our audience as well for their patience and for their questions. So be well, everybody. And I hope we'll see you next time soon.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.